Hello, good morning. After a section dedicated to Jewish Muslim sources to Jerusalem, we are now coming to an exclusively Christian section, and which deals, if I'm trying to find a common denominator for this section, it would be different ways to connect to Jerusalem from Europe, East and West, I believe. So the first speaker is Michael Sanders. He's a doctoral candidate in history at the Department of Fordham University in New York City. His paper today comes out of his dissertation, which he is working with Dr. Nicholas Paul on about the role of Jerusalem in Iberian political culture, namely how it shaped identity, kingship, and military plans from the 12th to early 16th centuries in Castile-Leon and Catalonia, Aragon. Prior to his studies at Fordham, he earned a BA in History and English at St. Vincent College in La Trobe, Pennsylvania, and the MA in History at Western Michigan University under the direction of Dr. Larry Simon. Michael is also working on a copy. He worked, or he is still working, as a copy editor for the academic journal Renaissance Quarterly, for which he also previously served as book reviews manager. Today, he will speak about From Santiago to the Holy Land, Itinera per Hispaniam to Jerusalem in Iberian political culture, 1100 to 1300. Michael, please.
Thank you. Before I begin, I would just like to thank the organizers and staff of the conference, especially for helping me set up today. This is a really wonderful opportunity to share my ideas, and it's my first time to Israel. I'm having a great time. So, on their way to the Holy Land in 1147 as part of the Second Crusade, contingents of Norman, Flemish, and other northern Europeans stopped in the city of Porto on the western coast of the Iberian Peninsula. The city's bishop, Pedro Petoyes, sought to enlist the Crusaders' aid in a campaign by the Count of Portugal to seize the Muslim-ruled city of Lisbon to the south. According to the Norman-French chronicler Raoul, one of the most forceful arguments which the bishop presented in a lengthy sermon was the following: "We believe it has already become well enough known in the countries from which you come that through the presence of the Moors and Moabites, divine vengeance has smitten all Spain with the edge of the sword. Alas, that in all Galicia and the kingdom of Aragon, of the numberless cities, castles, there should now remain hardly anything to be seen but the signs of ruin and the marks of the destruction which has been wrought. And from among the citizens and from the surrounding territory, as far as the church of St. James the Apostle, they bore away with them into their own country almost innumerable captives. Indeed, what does the coast of Spain offer to your view but a kind of memorial of its desolation and marks of its ruin?" The bishop, in other words, lamented the loss of Spain to the Muslims in 711 as retributions for the sins of the late antique Visigoths. This motif provided the basis for much, but certainly not all, of the ideology of Christian expansion in Iberia, commonly, though often erroneously, referred to as the Reconquista. It was so popular that the bishop and chronicler Raoul expected their audiences, despite coming from outside the peninsula, to be familiar with it already. Until the late 20th century, modern scholars too treated it as the dominant narrative of Iberian history from one end of the peninsula to the other. Yet despite the emotive images of destruction and desolation that the Reconquest evoked, Petoyes knew the Crusaders would need another reason to make a detour from their ultimate goal in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Holy Land offered well-known spiritual rewards, in addition to the material ones the Crusaders could obtain in Portugal. Hence the bishop continued his sermon, arguing, "Be not seduced by the desire to press on with the journey which you have begun, for the praiseworthy thing is not to have been to Jerusalem, but to have lived a good life well on the way. For you cannot arrive there except through the performance of his works. Therefore, as worthy rivals, strive together to raise up the fallen and prostrate Church of Spain." Based upon a fairly well-known letter of St. Jerome to Paulinus, This part of the sermon downplayed the significance of Jerusalem by emphasizing deeds over locations. What mattered for spiritual salvation was good works, and these could be performed anywhere. Promoting the reconquest at the expense of the Holy Land makes it easy to understand why scholars like Alan J. Forey, Susan B. Eddington, and Luis Garcia Guijarro argue the conquest of Lisbon should not be considered part of the Second Crusade. It seemed to have little to do with the wider expedition to recover the city of Edessa, conquered by the Turkish Atabad Zengi in 1144. But Jonathan Phillips, Simon Barton, and John Williams maintain the leaders of the crusade, especially Bernard of Clairvaux, always envisioned Lisbon as a part of it. The debate therefore continues, and spoiler alert, will not be settled by me today. This debate is important for our purposes because it is indicative of a wider issue in Iberian studies. What has Iberia to do with Jerusalem? Up until Patrick O'Banion asked the question in 2008, both Anglophone and Hispanophone scholarship offered few answers from a peninsular Christian perspective during the Middle Ages. Of course, the city always held religious significance, as it did for Jews and Muslims. Throughout the Middle Ages, Jerusalem functioned as historical memory, instrument of spiritual salvation, and hope for the future. It provided a system of metaphors, cultural cues, or code, as the title of a recent multi-volume work on Spain's influence on Scandinavian history suggests. But discussions about the physical city and its influence on political identity and kingship, what I call Jerusalemite discourses, seem scarce in the scholarship on medieval Iberia. This paper attempts to fill part of that lacuna by examining the origins of a crusade strategy known as the Iter per Hispaniam, the way through Spain to Jerusalem. It is perhaps best known through the treatises of the Majorcan mystic, missionary, and philosopher Ramon Lull. Writing after the fall of Acre in 1291, Lull advised recovering Christian rule in the Holy Land by first finishing the conquest of Islamic Iberia, El-Andalus, then conquering the Barbary coast or North Africa and Egypt, and finally, after establishing this strong supply line from Iberia to the Holy Land, taking Jerusalem and its environs. Lull was criticized by his medieval contemporaries as well as his modern commentators for many extravagant and extreme ideas, not the least of which was his Neoplatonic philosophy known as the art, so the Iter per Hispaniam might seem like one of his idiosyncratic ideas. But it was actually a well-established tradition by Lull's time and continued well into the early modern period, as attested by the recent translation of the 1626 Franciscan sermon, Jerusalem Afflicted, by Chad Leahy and Ken Tully. Today I want to examine the origins of this crusade route in the cities of Santiago de Compostela and Oviedo, which Raul actually alludes to in his chronicle of the conquest of Lisbon. Scholars have long recognized the bishop and eventually archbishop of Santiago de Compostela, Diego Gelmírez, originally came up with the idea in the early 1100s, and I argue his contemporary Bishop Peleo of Oviedo continued popularizing the idea, so that by the end of the century, concern for the earthly Jerusalem became a well-known factor in the political identity of Christians across the peninsula, from Portugal to Aragon. Examining Gelmírez and Peleo's routes or Itinera reveals both how Iberian Christians planned to get to Jerusalem, as well as how Jerusalem entered their political consciousness. Let us begin in Santiago de Compostela. It makes a lot of sense that the Spanish way to Jerusalem begins there, for the city arguably has the peninsula's closest links to the Holy Land, the relics of St. James the Greater. One of Jesus' earliest disciples and witness to his transfiguration, as well as other miracles, James became known as the apostle to Iberia by the late 6th century, and evidence of his relics in the peninsula arose a century later. But the detailed inventio traditions which describe how the relics arrived in Iberia did not begin appearing until the late 11th century. Some of the most well-known inventio accounts come from the 12th century Liber Sancti Jacobi, a compilation of 5 books with sermons, miracles, chronicles, and a guidebook to promote the cult of St. James at Compostela. The 3rd book of the compilation is devoted specifically to St. James's translation, but other accounts of his translation appear throughout the work, such as the following from a sermon on James' feast day, which is approaching actually at the end of this month. On the following night, his disciples came to him and found him, as we foretold, with knees bent and holding his head in his arms, and they placed his body and head in a box made of horn with aromatic spices, and accompanied by an angel of the Lord, transported him by sea from Jerusalem to Galicia. Most Inventio accounts of James mention his beheading by Herod Agrippa, but Compostellan accounts like this one emphasize the body and head came to Iberia. The reason for this emphasis comes from rival claims over James's remains. Since the establishment of the saint's cult in the early Middle Ages, Compostela had claimed to have the entire body of St. James. But it became necessary to stress the cult had the head in the early 12th century, indeed even through furta sacra or holy theft, when the Church of St. James in Jerusalem, under the patronage of Queen Melisande, the widow of the Crusader king of Jerusalem, Fulk of Anjou, announced it had the saint's head as well. This rivalry over relics occurred during the episcopate of Diego Gelmírez. Prior to accepting the mitre, Gelmírez served as secretary and chancellor to Ramon of Burgundy, Count of Galicia, and brother to Pope Calixtus II. Gelmírez's ties to the House of Burgundy undoubtedly helped him become a metropolitan bishop in 1120, but personal ties alone could not raise the bishop's status. Gelmírez knew he had to raise the prestige of Santiago de Compostela to justify it becoming an archbishopric. Hence, he became St. James's catapult, as one of his modern biographers has called him, and promoted the saint's cult as well as the pilgrimage route leading to it, that is, the Camino de Santiago, especially its branch known as the French Way. This promotion involved combating rival claims to James's relics, as we discussed, as well as patronizing grand works of Romanesque architecture, which often influences pilgrimage sites far from Santiago or Iberia. In fact, art historians consider the Platerías facade on the southern entrance of the Cathedral of Santiago as the model for the southern entrance of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Both have a twin portico and embrasure with archivolts intertwined in the center and two architraves containing figures. Additionally, each has an upper floor with a double window under embraced arches. Later on, the Holy Sepulchre's embrasure over the first floor columns could have influenced Santiago as well. Jerusalem, in other words, was both a rival and exemplum for Santiago. Diego wanted his archdiocese to have the same sacrality as Jerusalem, and consequently the Liber Sancti Jacobi begins with an apocryphal letter written by Pope Calixtus II to Diego and William, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Although he traveled on multiple occasions to southern France and Italy, Diego never went to Jerusalem himself. But he certainly supported Christians living there. In 1129, the Latin Patriarch Stephen thanked Gelmírez in a letter for his donations to the church in Jerusalem and proposed a confraternity between the two. As the first act of this brotherhood, he hoped the archbishop would accommodate a canon of the Holy Sepulchre named Aymeric and grant him the church of Santa Maria de Novara. Manuel Castaneras has argued the first relic of the true cross in Galicia, the Carbrero fragment, came to Compostela through this arrangement. Gelmírez undoubtedly sent members of his church to Jerusalem as well, for charters and other reports document numerous Galicians, such as the wealthy nobles Juan Diaz and Rodrigo Perez de Traba, venturing to the east, much like early medieval Iberians like Egeria or Martin of Braga, or the 11th and 12th century Catalonian pilgrims uncovered in several archives by Nicholas Jaspert and Karen Stober. Gelmírez promoted not only peaceful but also armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The first definite iteration of the Spanish Way to Jerusalem occurred at a regional church council convened by Gelmírez in 1124. The newly promoted archbishop implored his listeners. And just as the soldiers of Christ and faithful sons of Holy Church opened the way to Jerusalem with much labor and much shedding of blood, so also let us prove ourselves soldiers of Christ, and after the Saracens, his worst enemies, are subdued, let us, with Christ's grace as our aid, open a way which is shorter and much less laborious through the regions of Spain to the same sepulchre of the Lord. Later Spanish routes like Lulz would have more specific directions and list specific cities. Indeed, it is not clear if Gelmírez envisioned a land route across North Africa or a sea route across the Mediterranean, since it is hard to comprehend how the former could ever be considered shorter and much less laborious. Nevertheless, the core of the idea is here. The best way to Jerusalem, both spiritually and physically, is through Iberia. The archbishop tried to convince his audience that the reconquest was merely an extension of the First Crusade. Who was the archbishop's audience? It is hard to determine. The only source for the council, the Chronicle of Gelmírez's episcopate, known as the Historia Compostelana, simply states that, quote, bishops, abbots, and other religious persons were invited and counts and princes summoned. One of those bishops who may have come to the council was the Bishop of Oviedo, Pelayo. Unlike Gilmera's, scholars have overlooked Pelayo, at least in regard to his Jerusalemite discourse. The bishop is famous, or rather infamous, for his writing projects, namely a cartulary known as the Liber Testamentorum, and a collection of chronicles, including one written by the bishop himself, known as the Corpus Pelagianum. These texts include numerous forgeries and have led Peter Linehan to judge the bishop as, quote, a giant among falsifiers in an age which provided him with keen competition and ample opportunity. While Linehan maintained Pelayo insidiously enjoyed bending the truth, most scholars have softened their view. The bishop's forgeries were meant to protect his diocese from the encroachment of his neighbors, namely the diocese of Burgos and Lugo, as well as the archdiocese of Braga and Toledo. The latter were especially threatening since they sought to make Oviedo a suffragan see instead of seeking a particular territory. Much like Gilmera's, Pelayo had to increase the prestige of his see to remain independent. One way to do this was through forgeries, which showed the diocese was actually older than Toledo or Braga and had never been a part of El Andalus. Another way was through relics. Oviedo had a large collection of relics housed in the cathedral's treasury, known as the Camera Santa, and a large reliquary known as the Arca Santa. Inscriptions on the Ark, as well as translatio accounts, claim the collection dates back to the reign of Alfonso the Chaste in the mid-8th and 9th centuries. Coincidentally, this is the same monarch who founded the Camino de Santiago. But modern scholars note a lack of evidence for the collection until at least the late 11th century. The earliest evidence, moreover, is suspect, and thus debate continues over dating the Ark, as well as who created it: Pelayo, Alfonso VI of Leon Castile, etc. Another spoiler alert, I won't be settling this debate. For the purposes of this paper, it is important to note just that Pelayo's version of the relics translatio in his Liber Testamentorum became the most influential version of the text. Whether or not Pelayo created the Arca Santa, he certainly popularized it, and he did so through Jerusalemite discourses. These discourses become apparent simply by looking at the list of relics. Nearly all of them come from the Holy Land. Indeed, some of them literally are land from around Jerusalem, such as dirt from the Mount of Olives or from where Lazarus was resurrected. The largest group relate to Christ. Many were well-known pieces revered by Christians throughout the Middle Ages, like his blood, cross, and crown of thorns, although for some reason Pelayo considered jars from the wedding at Cana as the most valuable relics. The next group consists of relics from the Virgin Mary, apostles, saints, and biblical figures. Interestingly, this part of the list is the only section to contain a saint native to Iberia, San Ildefonso, and it appears the Visigothic bishop's pallium was included mainly because it was given by Mary. In other words, his connection to the Holy Land. Native saints were important to Christians in Iberia. Fernando I of Castile y León, for example, negotiated with the Taifa ruler of Seville for the relics of San Isidoro. In the modern era, General Francisco Franco chose to celebrate the 1100th anniversary of Alfonso the Chaste's death by carrying the Cross of Victory, a jewel-encrusted piece on the right, to commemorate several Asturian victories over Muslims, instead of Peter's sandal or the shroud of Oviedo pictured next to it. Yet the list of relics of the Arca Santa clearly gives the impression that Jerusalem is more important than Iberian soil. Pelayo, or rather one of his faithful copiers, illustrated this importance with a V in square map on the first folio of the Corpus Pelagianum. Modeled on maps by St. Isidore, this diagram divides the three known continents with a V shape inscribed in a square. It is surrounded by a genealogical list meant to trace the lineage of Asturians and their enemies. At its center lies a rather large depiction of Jerusalem. The image is so large, in fact, that it seems to shrink Asia, usually the largest part of this type of map. Each continent on the map, Europe, Asia, and Africa, has a city listed: Rome, Jerusalem, and Tingi, but only Jerusalem is graphically depicted. This conference has wonderfully shown how Jerusalem is considered the umbilicus mundi, so it's often expected that the city appears prominently in the center of all medieval maps. But this is often not the case. Take, for example, this V in square map from a copy of the Beatus of Libana's commentary on the Apocalypse, given to Fernando I and his wife Donna Sancha. Jerusalem is neither depicted nor listed within it. Instead, it describes which of Noah's sons received each continent and the continent's climate. Similarly, this TO map from a later Beatus composed in Burgos does not give much attention to Jerusalem. The city is pictured, but it is off-center and smaller than Babylon below it. In contrast, Pelayo's world map has a loud Jerusalemite discourse that attests to the bishop's interest in the city. This interest in the earthly Jerusalem suggests the translatio narrative of the Arca Santa needs reinterpreted. Scholars have considered Pelayo's account in the Liber Testamentorum as an attempt to boost Oviedo's prestige by making it a Spanish Jerusalem. The bishop wanted his see to replace the Eastern Mediterranean city for pilgrims according to this view. Hence, the translation account emphasizes destruction. The ark is made by disciples of the apostles in Jerusalem, but must be moved because of the Sasanian invasion of the Byzantine Empire in 602. Pelayo highlights that Jerusalem becomes an alien land and its temple is destroyed by Khosrow. It must be moved again from Africa as the Persians move into Egypt. While safe for some time in Toledo, Muslim expansion into Iberia forces it to move one last time to Oviedo in the kingdom of Asturias, whose mountains all but guarantee safety. Pelayo, in other words, establishes Oviedo as a fitting home for the Arca Santa. But is it a permanent one? In Pelayo's version of the Chronicle of Alfonso III and the Corpus Pelagianum, this translation is preceded by the Battle of Covendonga, the basis of the Reconquest narrative. The bishop thus entangles the relics with the Christian conquest of the peninsula. The Arca Santa is meant both to be protected by and to protect the Reconquista. Once the peninsula has been conquered, I argue that the bishop wanted Iberians to continue to Jerusalem. That is, to follow the Iter per Hispaniam and return the relics back to the Holy Land. This interpretation explains why Pelayo provides geographic details in his translatio. The ark moves from the Holy Land to Africa to Iberia. It's the Iter per Hispaniam in reverse. Pelayo offers more geographic details than Gelmírez did for his Iter, as well as the accounts of St. James's translation. Remember, the excerpt from the Liber Sanctae Jacobae, previously mentioned in the presentation, simply said James was transported by sea from Jerusalem to Galicia. No other places are mentioned in between. Such translatios stress the saint has found a new permanent home. Not so with the Arca Santa. The destruction described in the text is not meant to erase Jerusalem from memory, but rather function as an exhortation to recover it. Not unlike Urban II's speech at Clermont in 1095 that launched the First Crusade to Jerusalem. It seems likely that is one of the reasons why Urban is pictured in the Liber Testamentorum. Indeed, he is only one of 3 popes pictured. Due to the efforts of Pelayo and Gelmírez, it appears that Oviedo and Santiago became popular stops for crusaders en route to Jerusalem. While the Chronicle of the Conquest of Lisbon only mentioned the places briefly, the Chronicle of the Conquest of Silves in 1189, a part of the Third Crusade, and in many ways a repeat of the 1147 campaign against Lisbon, details how the Crusaders stopped in both cities. The author even repeats some of Pelayo's translatio, namely its geographic details, although it adds Seville. Rather than just copying Pelayo's Iter, the anonymous author of this chronicle then presents a detailed version of his own Spanish way to the Holy Land. Quote, Seville is very large and a most wealthy city. Cordoba is located 3 days from Seville. These are the towns which have cultivable land, Faro, Lule, Casella, Tavera, Mertola, and Serpa, which we might have taken with ease, and we would have left that land, which was called the Algarve, entirely in the hands of the Christians, if the hatred of the king and the accursed haste of some of our men had not prevented this. Had the author stopped here, the Iter would just be a route for the Reconquista. But the author continues. From Seville on the road towards the straits are the towns of Jerez, Rota, Cadiz, and Algeciras. From the Guadalquivir to Tarifa, which is the town next to the head of the straits, it is a day and a half. On the right, beyond the sea, we left behind us Africa. The first town which occurs there is Fadela, which is opposite St. Maria de Ferro. Then there is Lavu, Anaf, Saleh, Azamur, Messina, Arzilla, and Tangier, Marrakesh, the metropolis of Africa. From the head of the straits toward the interior begin Gomera or Barbary, and it continues to Mecca, where Muhammad is buried. As in the Second Crusade, the Crusaders who conquered Silves were Northern Europeans, as was the chronicler of the event. The inclusion of such a detailed Iter per Hispaniam in the chronicle attests to how far the idea had spread by the 12th century, and how closely Iberia had become tied to Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael Sanders. And now it is my pleasure to introduce another Michele Bacci, Professor of Medieval Art at the University of Fribourg, Switzerland, and a member of the Academy of Europe. He is the author of numerous studies on the artistic and cultural interactions in the medieval Mediterranean and beyond, as well as on the history of the religious practices associated with cult objects and holy sites. His books include Il Pennello dell'Evangelista, 1998, Pro Remedio Anime, 2000, Lo Spazio dell'Anima, 2005, San Nicola il Grande, Taumaturgo, 2009, The Many Faces of Christ, 2014, The Mystic Cave, A History of the Nativity Church in Bethlehem, 2017, and Veneto, Byzantine Interactions in Icon Painting, 11,280 to 2,450 in Greek in 2021. Michele will speak today about post-Crusader immersive devotions and the circuits of the Mount of Olives.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, the Franciscan Observant Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli in Lugano, Switzerland, is well known for its monumental tramezzo, a thick walled rood screen that neatly separated the nave reserved for the laity from the choir and altar space used by the friars who attended and performed the Mass. In its original appearance, it included only one central opening, the side ones having been made accessible only in 1853. Its painted decoration, realized by the Lombard artist Bernardino Luini in 1529, enabled the lay audience, prevented from distinctly inspecting the liturgical action, to direct their gaze on the mysteries of Christ's passion and resurrection that were reenacted on the other side of the barrier. The central vaulted corridor was closed with a rail fence, but whoever was allowed to enter it had a chance to add an extra dimension to her or his devotional experience. Opened in the thickness of the rood screen, it gave shape to an unusually wide threshold, a liminal environment interposed between the people and the altar space. It was here, in this intermediary context, that believers were encouraged to contemplate the pictorial views of, respectively, the Holy City and the Mount of Olives, displayed on both sides of the passageway. Those going along the path delimited by the two mural paintings were virtually transported into the valley of Jehoshaphat and thus encouraged to meditate on their uncertain destiny in the hereafter. Furthermore, they were reminded that experiencing the earthly Jerusalem at all its multiple metaphorical levels was conducive to its heavenly double, prefigured in the mysteries celebrated on the nearby altar. To obtain this goal, they were invited to follow in the steps of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, the apostles, and the saints who had left traces and markers of their deeds in Zion's physical landscape. In the murals, which can be assumed to date from around 1540, all holy sites were marked with inscriptions, now mostly vanished, which summarize their memorial associations. Viewers were instructed about the distinctive qualities of all the holy spots that anchored the gospel episodes to distinctive locations and were not only worthy of worship per se, but were also viewed as mutually interrelated elements of wider topographic networks defined by the kinetic in-between movement of pilgrims. The Mount of Olives was rendered as a three-hilled environment dotted with a great many diminutive Renaissance-style chapels. This view looks much like contemporary Sacramonti, San Vivaldo, or Varallo, whose visitors could replicate the embodied experience of Jerusalem pilgrims by moving from one site to another and performing the associated prayers and devotions. The aim of the painting was not so much to represent the holy spots as they looked like, but rather to evoke them in a way that made them easily acknowledgeable as worthy of worship in accordance with contemporary Catholic practice. Reality was different. Before the establishment of the status quo in 1852, the only covered and consecrated structures on the slopes of the Mount of Olives were the Tomb of Mary and the nearby Grotto of Agony. Furthermore, the old chapel of the Ascension, though converted into a mosque, was used for Latin liturgy on the eve of the yearly feast. Other built landmarks invested with Christian associations were the burial cave of Pelagia and the ancient tombs at the feet of the Mount of Offense. Otherwise, pilgrims were expected to climb a steep, bare ridge whose most prominent and eye-catching features were a few olive, fig, and almond trees, some remnants of ruined buildings, and a plethora of large stones dotting the paths to the summit. Such landmarks encountered along the way were viewed as material indicators of gospel events and accordingly venerated in their open sky locations with prayers and other devotions. The exceptional and to some extent disruptive circumstances under which such exercises of piety took place were nicely summarized with these words by a 16th century pilgrim. It is worth remarking that churches were used to stand on all such sites, but now everything is destroyed, and there are only some stones as memorials. The kinetic dimension of pilgrimage played a major impact on the process whereby this landscape came to be apprehended as an almost uninterrupted sequence of worth commemorating spots. The Mount of Olives was viewed by Christians as a dynamic scenery characterized by the upward trajectories of Christ's ascension and Mary's assumption, and by the downward itinerary of the Palm Sunday. The climb to the mountain's top was experienced as a physical effort surrogating and foreshadowing the ascensional movement toward heaven they wished for their souls, whereas the descent along a steep downhill road enabled them to rely the hardness of Christ's trip on the back of a donkey. The exhortation to follow in the steps of the Lord and his saints was interpreted in quite literal terms, not because pilgrims were unaware of its moral or anagogical implications, but rather as they believed that repeating the Holy One's movements was conducive to a deeper awareness and thus to a closer imitation of their exemplary lives. Their bodies were the instruments through which such an immersive, emotionally charged identification could take place. Aware as they were that they were walking the very paths trodden by Jesus, Mary, and the apostles, they started viewing some distinctive prominent features of the environment as suggestive or narrative associations with sacred events. Pilgrims started their ascent to the mountaintop from the crossroads where the road coming from the Cedron Bridge forked into three, and regularly went by the middle one, which was shorter, but also much steeper and bumpier than the others. Then, after visiting the holy sites on the upper ridge, they redescended downwards toward the Valley of Jehoshaphat through the southern part. Unsurprisingly, a great many new holy spots emerged along this itinerary from the late 13th century onwards, whereas the unused northern road did not undergo any specific process of sacralization. Many of such loca sancta were conceived of as stations or material indicators of stopovers made by the holy people during physically and emotionally demanding journeys. Their identification was largely conditioned by their specific setting, materiality, and spatial relation to the major shrines. A case in point is the so-called Dominus Flevit, the place from which, according to Luke 19, Jesus wept over Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Since the 1280s, the episode was located about halfway up the slope, at a height from which a full view of the city could be enjoyed. At that spot, wayfarers could not fail to notice a wide, smooth, and grey-colored stone that occupied the moss part of the road and signposted the narrow track that led to the northern hill. It could be easily inferred that Jesus had been forced to make a stop there, since it was likely that the donkey refused to proceed over a slippery surface and had thus to be held down. In this way, the pilgrim's scrutiny and physical experience of the environment led to the identification of a new holy spot. When stopping there, pilgrims repeated Christ's devotional gesture by casting a glance upon the town and meditating on its sad destiny. In the 14th through the 16th centuries, the pilgrims' paths were gradually enriched with new worship-worthy stations, all of which were meticulously recorded in the Lugano painting. In the years preceding the fall of Acre in 1291, the visit was still focused on the traditional sites, whose architectural frames were mostly in a ruinous state, like the Basilica of the Holy Saviour in Gethsemane, or the Chapel of the Lord's Prayer that had been erected in the 12th century on the site of the ancient Eleona Church. The open sky memorial stone of the Dominus Flevit was by then still a novelty that paved the way for the identification of more elements of landscape as bearers of scriptural associations. In the first half of the 14th century, another 6 new spots were mentioned in prominent or liminal locations along the itinerary of visitors. A white stone encountered at the junction of the northern and middle roads, not far from the tomb of Mary, was identified with the place where the Apostle Thomas had received the girdle that was thrown to him by the Virgin as she was taken to heaven in the day of her assumption. The northern hill was identified as the small Galilee where the disciples gathered, who would have gathered after Christ's resurrection, according to Matthew 28, verse 16, and the memory of this episode was more specifically located in a house and cistern that could be seen on its top. Midway between the latter and the Chapel of Ascension, near a crossroads, they encountered another stone which was deemed to mark the place where, according to apocryphal traditions, an angel had announced to Mary her imminent death. A few ruined buildings on the southern part of the ridge and its slopes offered an opportunity to locate material markers of the major articles of Christian faith. A stone inserted in a standing wall was deemed to be the one on which Christ had written the Pater Noster. A nearby ruined building was said to be the place where the apostles had composed the Credo, and a further large stone in the middle of the descent was imagined to be the one on which Jesus was sitting as he pronounced the parable of the Beatitudes and predicted his second coming. Finally, the destruction of the Gethsemane Basilica encouraged viewers to relocate the most dramatic event of the arrest narrative, Christ's agony and threefold prayer, in the grotto near the tomb of Mary, and to identify the field outside the ruined building as the scenery of Judas's kiss. The establishment of the custody of the Holy Land in the second quarter of the 14th century had a major impact on this process. Not only did the Franciscans largely orchestrate the pilgrims' experience by guiding and instructing them, But they also codified the itineraries into sequences of venerable spots whose worship worthiness was precisely quantified in terms of earnable spiritual rewards, in keeping with the cumulative approach that underlay contemporary religious sensibility. Pious travelers were eager to visit as many loca sancta as possible in the aim to get the associated indulgences which, depending on the memorial importance of each site, could be either plenary, that is, ensuring full remissions of all sins, or of 7 years and 7 carims, or periods of 40 days. So the climb of the Mount of Olives became one of the many circuits recommended in the Libri Indulgentiarii, produced and sold in the Mount Zion convent, where the holy places were listed in their topographic sequence. Here, even secondary moments of the gospel events found a precise location. The Garden of Gethsemane came to include 3 new holy spots, which commemorated the place where Jesus had left Peter, James, and John, 4a, Judas's kiss, 4b, and Peter's outburst of anger against Malchus, the servant of the Pharisees, 4c. What is more, the Virgin Mary was credited with establishing this practice of circuits, and she was said to have often sat on a stone that the pilgrims encountered along the southern descent. A few more spots were integrated in the 15th century. Thus, in no other place on earth it was possible to earn so many indulgences as in the Holy Land, given that almost all stones, springs, trees, roads, portions of grounds, and ruined buildings could be expected to be to some extent associated with the deeds of Jesus, Mary, and the saints. Therefore, it was important to scrutinize the landscape in search of visible traces of the Holy One's passage. Furthermore, pilgrims were convinced that in order to earn the associated pardons, they had to rightly perform all the devotional acts envisaged for each place. Special prayers were worked out by the friars and recorded in their books, but as the Italian Pietro Casola remarked, the friars were often omitted or were prevented from their recitation during the visit. Given that worship could hardly be manifested in a more canonical way, site-bound indulgences were appropriated through more personal and intimate expressions of faith, implying a direct physical and embodied interaction with the open-air, hallowed environment. As emphasized above, most places were signposted by stones. The way in which they had to be honored could be inferred from their material appearance. The absence of grass around them indicated that worshippers were used to kneel and kiss their surface, which appeared unnaturally polished and covered with a layer of fat produced by contact with human lips. As Felix Fabri indicates, the indulgence was earned in the very moment as this contact happened, if it was obviously animated by sincere piety. Okay. This meant that kissing was imperative in all circumstances, even if the stones were covered with dung or if the absence of any outcrop of rock forced visitors to direct their devotion to the ground. When possible, the sense of touch could be enhanced by stimulating taste. For example, the cavities of Christ's imprint in the Chapel of Ascension were repleted with wine and lapped by people who believed in this way to more efficaciously appropriate its site-bound sanctity. Olfactive sensations contributed to enhance the quest for physical contact with the divine sphere. As they prostrated in the cave of agony, believers had a feeling of breathing a supernatural smell produced by the bloody sway to the Son of God. Apart from enabling worship of specific sites, bodies were the tools through which the venerable people's physical movement on the surface of the Holy Land could be reenacted. Going from one spot to another was often described as an act of measuring in-between distances whose results depended on each pilgrim's stride length and physical energies. Such measures were not conceived of as abstract mathematical notions, but as the outcomes of individual movements. Thus, the expression stone's throw, used by Luke 22, verse 41, to describe how far Jesus withdrew beyond his three sleeping disciples, was understood by visitors as an archetypal gesture they were invited to imitate by actually throwing a stone from one spot toward the other. Indulgences were therefore deemed to be earnable through physical actions engaging the five senses and arousing a feeling of breaching the temporal barriers between the present time and sacred history. Nevertheless, not all sights were accessible, and their multisensorial experience could only be surrogated by sight. Climbing the slopes of the Mount of Olives enabled pilgrims to glance on otherwise invisible loca sancta, such as the Golden Gate, whose plenary indulgence could only be appropriated by kneeling, praying, and gazing upon it from the opposite sides in the Garden of Gethsemane. All the pardons associated with places forbidden to Christians, such as the Templum Domini, the Palace of Pilate, and the House of St. Anne, could be obtained by scrutinizing Jerusalem's cityscape from the Viri Galilee hill, whereas looking towards east or north from the same mountain granted beholders the same spiritual advantages as the journeys to Jordan or Galilee. The summit was often reached in the late night in time to profit from the apparition of Jerusalem hollowed cityscape at first light of dawn. In Lugano, the two pendant mural paintings fixed and pictorially surrogated the pilgrim's gaze upon the city and the mountain, whose landscape consisted of networks of mutually interrelated holy spots. The implicit assumption was that looking at a painted evocation of the Loca Sancta could, at least to some extent, be as beneficial to the soul as their embodied and emplaced experience. Thank you so much.
The next two lectures in this section are dedicated to the Czech lands. And the first one would be Dr. אורית רמון מהמחלקה להיסטוריה, פילוסופיה ומדע היהדות באוניברסיטה הפתוחה. היא עוסקת בהבניית זהות בעיקר במפגשים בין דתיים ובין תרבותיים. מחקריה עוסקים ביחסים בין יהודים לנוצרים בארצות הצ'כיות ובעלייה לרגל מהארצות האלה לארץ הקודש בראשית העת החדשה. יחד עם זאת, העיסוק האחר של אורית הוא בא לידי ביטוי בספרה האחרון, ישו היה יהודי, שהמהדורה העברית שלו יצאה השנה בהוצאת רסלינג, והוא דן ביחסים שבין יהודים לנוצרים וביחס הנצרות במערכת החינוך הישראלית ובהבניה של זהות יהודית ישראלית. אורית, בבקשה, היא תדבר היום על דרך הצלב ברימוב והקתוליזציה מחדש של בוהמיה.
אז השם הוא ז'ימוב, ואני מתנצלת, גם אני מתנצלת מראש בפני כל דוברי הצ'כית באולם, זה צליל בלתי אפשרי. אז אנחנו עם דרך הצלב בז'ימוב, ודרך הצלב, כמו שאנחנו מכירים אותה, היום מתחילה בהצטלבות של רחוב הגיא עם הרחוב שנכנס לעיר העתיקה של ירושלים ממזרח, שאנחנו קוראים לו הוויה דולורוזה, או דרך האיסורים. הוא מתחיל במקום המשפט אצל פונטיוס פילטוס, מסתיים בכנסיית הקבר בקבר ישו, והדרך הזאת מונה 14 תחנות שמציינות אירועים שונים שהתרחשו ביום שישי הטוב, חלקם נזכרים בכתבי הקודש, חלקם נסמכים על מסורות חיצוניות. אבל לדרך הצלב בירושלים היו נתיבים שונים מזה שמוכר היום, והם חיברו אתרים ואירועים אחרים או נוספים לאלה שהתקדשו ונבנו לאורך התוואי המוכר הזה. חשוב לענייננו שהנתיב הזה על כל המסלולים והאתרים השונים שלו, הפך מאז המאה ה-14 לציר המרכזי של הנוכחות הלטינית בירושלים, הרבה אחרי שהלטינים כבר לא שלטו בה. עוד חשוב לומר כבר עכשיו שהשימוש הזה במושג תחנות, והאמת היא שפרופסור קוחנל דיברה על זה בהרצאת הפתיחה, כן, התיאור הזה של העצירות הליטורגיות בתהלוכות שהיו נערכות ברומא, אבל המונח הזה מופיע לראשונה בתיאור ההליכה בדרך הצלב אצל הצליין האנגלי וויליאם ווי, שביקר בירושלים פעמיים, ב-1458 וב-1462, ובתיאור שלו מופיע לראשונה גם המספר 14 כמניין התחנות, למרות שרק 5 מהתחנות שהוא מציין תואמות את התחנות שאנחנו מכירים היום. מי שקבע סופית את ה-14 כמספר התחנות היה האפיפיור קלמנט ה-12 בראשית המאה ה-18, דווקא בהקשר להעתקים שהיו לפרנציסקנים של דרך הצלב באירופה, ובמידה רבה ההתקבעות הזאת הייתה תוצאה של הזיקות שנוצרו בין המסלול בירושלים ובין אותם מקומות שאליהם הועתקה דרך הצלב. לענייננו בז'ימוב יש 25 תחנות. עוד עניין חשוב לפני שאנחנו מגיעים לז'ימוב, ההליכה בנתיב של דרך הצלב היא בבסיסה ליטורגיה של תחנות, פרקטיקה שמחברת באמצעות התהלוכה ציוני דרך פיזיים לכדי נרטיב או סיפר אחד מקודש שמעוגן לרוב בכתבי הקודש. המעשה הפולחני שמתרחש בכל תחנה קושר את הסיפר המקודש למקום ומסמן באמצעות זה את הקדושה של האתר עצמו, אבל למעשה גם מאפשר למאמין לקרוא מחדש את עיקרי האמונה שלו במרחב פיזי נתון. ועכשיו רימוב. אז רימוב נמצאת פה, בין צ'סקה בודיוביצה לצ'סקי קרומלוב, כשפראג נמצאת פה למעלה, ממש בדרום בוהמיה, על נהר או נחל שנקרא המלשה. ועוד הערה לפני ויש בו, כן, זה המסלול של 25 התחנות, שאני לא אציג את כולן כמובן מפאת קוצר הזמן, שיש בדרך הצלב בז'ימוב. ועוד הערה אחת אולי, בתחנות האלה היו מוצגים פסלים כבר מהמאה ה-17, אבל מטבע הדברים הם צוירו, הציורים והפסלים עוצבו מחדש, כי הם נפגעו כמה וכמה פעמים. איזה פאנ פקט, אני חושבת מעניין את זה שהשיפוץ העיקרי של הדרך הזאת נעשה תחת הפרוטקטורט ב-1944, אבל בגלל גנבות שהתרחשו שם מתחילת שנות ה-2000, כל הפסלים נלקחו, ומה שנמצא באתר עצמו זה צילום של הפסלים שאמורים ליצור להם עותקים, והם אמורים להיות מוצבים בתחנות עצמם. אז זאת התחנה הראשונה. והתחנה הראשונה, הסצנה שמונצחת בה, אין לה מקום בברית החדשה, אבל היא מופיעה במחזות פסיון, והיא מתארת את הפרידה של מריה מישוע בבית אניה או בביטיניה לאחר ההחייאה של לזרוס, ומה שמציין אותה זה התחנה הזאת, המתומן הברוקי הזה. כדי להגיע לתחנה השנייה צריך לטפס קצת על הגבעה, מגיעים אז לחדר הסעודה האחרונה, כן, שנמצאת על הר ציון, וכמו שאתם רואים, כן, יש פה את השולחן בלי הפסלים שכאמור נגנבו. משם יורדים לשער העיר, שער גת שמנים, שעולי רגל צ'כים שביקרו בירושלים, פחות או יותר באותו זמן שנבנתה הדרך הזאת, מציינים שבימי ישוע השער הזה נקרא שער העמק או שער הגיא, באיזשהו רפרור לצדקיהו המקראי, וזאת כבר החצר או המערה בגת שמנים שבה השליחים ישנים, ופה למעלה ברקע אפשר לראות את הציור הדהוי הזה של הסילואטה של ירושלים. אחרי זה יש גם את קפלת הרוח העצובה שבה ישוע מבקש מפטרוס, יוחנן ויעקב לשקוד עמו, וזאת כבר התחנה הבאה למרגלות הר הזיתים. אתם יכולים לראות את הר הזיתים עם הקפלה למעלה ואת ישוע מתפלל ושלושת השליחים שנרדמים לצידו. עכשיו כבר בשלב הזה, בתיאור של הדרך הזאת, אפשר לזהות שני מאפיינים חשובים של דרך הצלב הזאת. אחד, התחנות שציינו מספרות סיפור הרבה יותר ארוך מזה שאנחנו מכירים, ובמידה רבה הן עוקבות אחרי מסלול הביקור בירושלים, כפי שהוא מתואר על ידי עולי רגל, וחלק מעולי הרגל אפילו כותבים במפורש שמדובר בחלק מדרך השבי, הוויה קפטיביטטיס, כן? שהיא חלק מהמסלול בירושלים. הדבר השני, אפשר כבר בשלב הזה להבין שהטופוגרפיה מותאמת לסיפור ולמהלך המסלול בירושלים. הסעודה האחרונה היא על הר או גבעת ציון, הר הזיתים מודגש. העיצוב של הדרך עושה שימוש בנוף שיוצר לא רק את הזהות עם ירושלים, אלא גם את הדרמה בעצם של דרך הצלב. אז אחר כך, כשיורדים מהר הזיתים, והר הזיתים פה, יורדים מהר הזיתים, אנחנו מגיעים לאתר שמציין, עוד לתחנה שמציינת את נשיקת יהודה, ויש אחר כך, כן, את ישוע קשור שמובל מן הגן וכולי, וזה כבר הקדרון שאותו ישוע חוצה עם שני החיילים שמובילים אותו מעבר לו, אחרי זה הוא גם, יש תחנה שמציינת את זה שהוא נזרק אל הבוץ, הוא מוכנס חזרה אל תוך העיר דרך השער הזה שנזכר כשער המים, ככה הוא נקרא באתר עצמו, עם איזשהו רפרור למסע הלילה של נחמיה, אבל עולי רגל צ'כים ששוב מסיירים בירושלים באותה תקופה קוראים לו פורטה ג'ורדני, ומציינים שזה השער שדרכו נכנסים או יוצאים מהעיר להר ציון, והנה פה אנחנו מתחילים את הסיבוב על הר ציון, והתחנה הראשונה שם היא אצל חנן, כן, אתר שנזכר כחלק מהסיבוב בהר ציון, חנן חותנו של קייפה שחקר את ישוע ואחר כך מעביר אותו למשפט אצל קייפה כהן הגדול, ופה זה המבנה שמציין את בית קייפה, ובאחד החדרים בתוך המבנה הזה מופיעה הנערה שמתחממת ליד האש, ופטרוס כמובן שמתכחש לישוע. מכאן הוא מועבר אל בית פילטוס, אבל פה יש עוד איזשהו מהלך ששוב אנחנו מכירים מטקסטים של עולי רגל, יש העברה של ישוע לידיו של הורדוס, מושל הגליל שבמקרה היה בירושלים, ופילטוס מעביר את המשפט, את הדיון בישוע אליו. מכאן בעצם, כן, זה השלב שבו מתחילה הדרך שאנחנו מכירים היום. התחנה הזאת היא ארמון הורדוס, כן, מכאן מתחילה ויה קרוציס או דרך הצלב. התחנה הבאה היא ארמון פילטוס, כן, ששם אפשר לראות את ההלקאה של ישוע, את הנחת כתר הקוצים, ולמעלה פילטוס שיוצא אל המרפסת ויש שם את הכתובת אקה הומו. אחר כך הצלב מוטל על כתפיו, הוא פוגש את מריה, הוא פוגש את ורוניקה, עובר את שער המשפט, או כמו שהוא נקרא כאן שער ההוצאה להורג, שם הוא פוגש את בנות ירושלים שבוכות עליו, ובדרך אל הצליב, ברח לי? כן, בדרך אל הקלבריה או אל הגולגותה, שם נמצא ביתו של שמעון מקירני. ביתו של שמעון מקירני נמצא כאן אחרי שער המשפט, ואז באמת התחנות האחרונות על הגולגותה, אפשר גם זאת גבעה, אפשר לראות את שלושת הצלבים, את הדמויות של מריה מגדלנה ויוחנן, יש כאן את הפייטה, וקפלת הקבר עצמו, שזאת הייתה הקפלה הראשונה שנבנתה בדרך הצלב הזאת. אז זאת דרך הצלב, 8 תחנות מתוכה תואמות את מה שאנחנו מכירים היום. אבל המסלול הזה בז'ימוב הוא רק חלק מהקומפלקס, והוא מתחיל למעשה במתחם רחב של עלייה לרגל, שבמרכזו נמצאת קפלת הלורטו או הסנקטה קאזה, העתק של ביתה של מריה שהוא עבר על פי המסורת בדרך נס מנצרת, היו לו תחנות בדרך עד שהוא הגיע ללורטו באיטליה, ממש רגע לפני הכיבוש המוסלמי של ארץ הקודש. המתחם הוא מתחם, כן, הלורטו נמצא בתוך מתחם מרובע, בתוך חצר, שמוקפת מסביב ב34 ציורים של סצנות מחיי מריה, כשמעל הקשתות, כן, הקשתות שנפתחות אל החצר, מצוירים 32 אתרי עלייה לרגל של מריה בארצות הצ'כיות עצמם, ואני לא יודעת אם אתם יכולים לראות, אבל כן, זה קצת חשוך, אבל זה סיפור ההתגלות ברימוב. עכשיו, בארצות הצ'כיות היו כבר אתרים שהוקדשו למריה כבר מהמאה ה-13, אבל אתר כזה שמחובר עם דרך צלב מופיע בפעם הראשונה ברימוב עצמה. בפינות של הקלויסטר הזה, של החצר, משולבים 4 מזבחות שבהם נערכו המיסות בעלייה לרגל. יש שם את מזבח הצלב הקדוש, גבירתנו של הצער, מזבח לכבודו של סנט ליאונרד, אחד הקדושים החשובים בימי הביניים, והמזבח האחרון שיהיה חשוב לענייננו, מזבח לוואצלב הקדוש, הקדוש הפטרון הצ'כי, ועוד יש במתחם הזה קפלה או כנסייה שמוקדשת לרוח הקודש, שאחד הדימויים הבולטים בה הוא זה. כן, דימוי של ירושלים לא מאוד מדויק מבחינת הכיוונים שלו, אבל ירושלים. בגדול אפשר לומר שבאתר הזה הסיפור של מריה משולב כסיפור מקדים לסיפור של ישוע. במאמר מוסגר אני אומרת, הקפלה הראשונה שהיא קפלת הפרידה של מריה מישוע, היא החוליה המקשרת בין הסיפור של מריה לסיפור של ישוע, והתוספת של קפלת רוח הקודש יוצרת שילוב בעצם של 3 מושאי הפולחן הקתולים המובהקים ביותר, וככה נראים הטקסים ברימוב היום. אז איך אפשר להסביר את התופעה הזאת של ההעתק הזה, כן, של הקומפלקס הזה בכלל? אני חושבת שפרופסור קוחנל העלתה כמה הצעות שוב בהרצאת הפתיחה, ולגבי ז'ימוב באופן כללי הטענה היא שהבנייה של אתרי פולחן למריה וישוע היו כלי ברקתוליזציה של בוהמיה. העתקה או טרנסלציו של מסורות ואתרים קתולים מובהקים מירושלים היו כלי בלגיטימיזציה של הקתוליות במרחב שלא היה כזה עד אז. ופה אני מוסיפה איזשהו הסבר במאמר, או איזושהי הרחבה במאמר מוסגר, הרחבה קצרה. אני אומרת שהרפורמציה בבוהמיה התרחשה בערך 100 שנה לפני הרפורמציה של לותר. הדמות המרכזית ברפורמציה הצ'כית הייתה הדמות של יאן הוס, וכשיאן הוס הוא עלה על המוקד ב-1415 באשמת מינות, התומכים שלו הצליחו לבלום מסעי צלב שנשלחו על ידי הקיסר והאפיפיור, ובוהמיה התקיימה למעשה בערך כ100 שנים כממלכה הוסיטית. מראשית המאה ה-16, תחת השלטון של בית הבסבורג הקתולי, התחיל תהליך הרקתוליזציה האיטי של בוהמיה, אבל בעצם רק אחרי מרד האצולה הצ'כית הפרוטסטנטית בשלטון הקתולי, ב-1618 זה המרד שמתחיל את מלחמת 30 השנה, ובעיקר אחרי התבוסה הצ'כית הפרוטסטנטית בקרב ההר הלבן ליד פראג ב-1620, רק אז התחילה קתוליזציה שיטתית של השטח. הכוחות הקתולים המנצחים ראו את עצמם כמי שמטהרים את הארץ ממינים וחוטאים, במידה רבה בכוחה של מריה, וזה ציור שמתאר את הניצחון בקרב ההר הלבן. אתם יכולים לראות את הסילואטה של פראג באופק. מריה מופיעה כגבירתנו של הניצחון, מריה דלה ויטוריה, וסביבה מלאכים, ופה אפשר לראות את פרדיננד השני, הקיסר, ובנו פרדיננד השלישי, עם האריה הבוהמי ביניהם. מתוך שכך הטענה בדרך כלל זה שהקתוליזציה של המרחב היה אחד הכלים האפקטיביים בידי מובילי הקונטר-רפורמציה, כן, הרפורמציה הקתולית, בתיאור של בוהמיה ממינים ופרוטסטנטים למיניהם, והפיכתה של בוהמיה לקדושה, בוהמיה סקרה. עכשיו, אם נחזור לרימוב, אחרי קרב ההר הלבן, הנחלה ברימוב הוחרמה, כמו הרבה נחלות פרוטסטנטיות צ'כיות אחרות, בגלל ההשתתפות של הבעלים שלהם במרד הצ'כי, והיא הועברה לידיים קתוליות, לפעמים גם ידיים גרמניות. במקרה של רימוב, הנס אולריך מאגנברג, שהיה האדון של צ'סקי קרומלוב, וכבר מהדברים האלה אתם יכולים להבין שהמעבר מפרוטסטנטיות לקתוליות היה כרוך, במקרה הזה לפחות, במעבר מצ'כיות לגרמניות. ביוזמתו של אגנברג, כבר ב-1626 הוענקה רימוב לישועים מצ'סקי קרומלוב, וגם כאן במאמר מוסגר אני אומרת, הישועים פעלו בבוהמיה מאמצע המאה ה-16, הם פעלו מהמרכז שלהם בפראג, והם אלה שהכניסו את כל העניין של מחזות ייסורים, דרכי צלב, אתרי פולחן למריה, וגם בדרום בוהמיה פעלה אגודה ישועית מ-1584, ובתוך האגודה הישועית הזאת בדרום בוהמיה צמח האיש שזה היה החזון שלו, שמו היה יאן גורה, והוא היה לו חלום, כן, בחלום ישו התגלה, ישו ומריה התגלו אליו, ושניהם ביקשו ממנו להקים ברימוב דרך צלב ואת הסנקטה קאזה. עכשיו, את ההוראות לבנייתה של דרך הצלב הזאת הוא קיבל שוב על פי המסופר מהאח אלכסנדר, שנשלח לירושלים במיוחד, ושם הוא חלם את אותו חלום שחלם יאן גורה בצ'כיה, וחזר עם תיאור ומידות מדויקות של הטופוגרפיה ושל כל הכיוונים והמרחקים, גם לאישור האותנטיות וגם כדי לאפשר, כן, חיקוי, אימיטציו קריסטי נכון יותר. מי שהעניק את האישור להקמת האתר היה הארכיבישוף של פראג, שגם מימן את הבנייה. אבן הבנייה, ופה אני בכוונה מדגישה, אבן הפינה הונחה ב-20 ביולי 1648, כן, רק צריך לשים לב שהסכם וסטפליה, שזה ההסכם שמסיים את מלחמת 30 השנה, נחתם ב-24 באוקטובר באותה שנה. הישועים גם מימנו נוכחות קבועה של 2 נזירים צ'כים שיעניקו שירותים לעולי הרגל, ובמחצית השנייה של המאה ה-17 נקבעו תאריכי עלייה לרגל קבועים למקום, ביום מציאת הצלב, יום רוממות הצלב, הביקור של מריה וביום כל הקדושים. הערכה של בואוסלב בלבין, כן, הוא נחשב הפליניוס הצ'כי, כן, היסטוריון צ'כי ישועי, שמחבר את הספר הזה, דיבה מונטי סנקטי, שיוצא לאור ב-1665 ומתאר את אתרי הפולחן ועלייה לרגל הקתולים העיקריים בבוהמיה. אז הערכה שלו היא שלרימוב הגיעו כבין 40 ל-80 אלף עולי רגל בשנה. בעמוד הפנימי של הספר של בלבין אפשר לראות עוד רכיב מעניין לסיפור הזה, כן? פה מופיע הר קדוש אחר, סקרימונטי אחר בבוהמיה, אבל ההר הזה מופיע בתור חלק אחד או בחבורה אחת עם הרים מקראיים כמו הר סיני, חורב, מוריה, הרי הלבנון, והאיור הזה אולי משקף יותר מהכל את תודעת הקדושה של בוהמיה, שהיא סוג של שלוחה או חלק מארץ הקודש. על פניו ניכוס ישועי, קתולי, כן, של המרחב הצ'כי, כדי למשמע את האוכלוסייה הפרוטסטנטית המקומית. אבל, כן, אין ספק שבבוהמיה נעשה שימוש אינטנסיבי בבניית אתרי פולחן שהרחיבו את ההשפעה ונתנו לגיטימציה לשליטה הקתולית. אבל נראה לי שלא כדאי לעשות רדוקציה של פולחן המקומות הקדושים למונחים של משמוע דתי או חברתי בלבד. אם לוקחים בחשבון את הזמן הקצר יחסית שעבר מרגע יוזמת ההקמה של האתר ברימוב ועד להפיכתו לאתר עלייה לרגל פופולרי, נראה לי שקשה להסביר את הרקתוליזציה רק במושגים של כוח, בעיקר בכל מה שנוגע למימד הוולונטרי והעממי שבתופעת העלייה לרגל. צריך גם לשים לב מי היה שותף להקמה של האתר ברימוב, כמו גם דרך אגב באתרים אחרים. האצולה, אדוני הנחלות, הם אלה שדחפו להקמת התשתיות, המסדרים הדתיים, כן, במקרה של רימוב, הישועים, וקהילות או אנשים פרטיים, רבים מהם צ'כים שקידמו את הקמת האתר. וההצלחה של אתרי הצליינות האלה הייתה בסופו של דבר תוצר של פעילות משותפת של קבוצות אוכלוסייה שונות. וחשוב אולי עוד יותר מבחינתנו, הוא שבתודעה הצ'כית, בוהמיה הייתה ארץ הקודש, או בוהמיה סקרה, הרבה לפני שהישועים הגדירו אותה ככזאת. קרל הרביעי, המלך הצ'כי וקיסר הקיסרות הרומית הקדושה, הוא שבנה במאה ה-14 את פראג כירושלים, ובחסות הכנסייה הקתולית גם ניתנו בפראג אינדולגנציות על השתתפות בטקסים או ביקורים באתרים ירושלמיים. במרכזה של ירושלים הזאת עמדה כנסיית הקבר, היא כנסיית ויטוס הקדוש, שבה נמצא לא קבר ישו, אבל קברו של ואצלב, המרטיר הקדוש, הפטרון הצ'כי, שהפולחן שלו היה העתק של הפסיון של ישוע. הדימוי הזה הקרין כבר במאה ה-14 על הזיהוי של בוהמיה כולה כארץ הקודש, בוהמיה סקרה, ובמידה רבה גם על הזיהוי של הצ'כים את עצמם בתור העם הנבחר. אני מזכירה שברימוב, יחד עם העתקת האתרים מארץ הקודש והפולחן של ישוע ומריה, הונצחו גם האתרים שהוקדשו למריה בארצות הצ'כיות, שלל האתרים, וגם שם היה משולב פולחן לוואצלב הקדוש. הקדוש הפטרון, ישוע הצ'כי, ומי שזכה לקרדיט על הצלת פראג במלחמת 30 השנה. וכמו הפולחן של ישוע ומריה, גם הפולחן שלו התפשט ברחבי בוהמיה עם סיומה של המלחמה. ולדימוי הזה יש עוד גלגול, או עוד מופע. החשיבות שהייתה לתחושת הנבחרות המקראית הזאת, הניעה רפורמציה דתית צ'כית, וכן שלמעשה קרל הרביעי היה זה שדחף אותה. הרפורמציה הזאת דווקא משום דבקותה בכתבי הקודש מצד אחד, ובצ'כיות מצד שני, לא ויתרה על הזיהוי של בוהמיה עם ארץ הקודש. בית לחם הייתה כנסיית הרפורמה המרכזית שבה הטיף יאן הוס, ומאוחר יותר תסומן דרום בוהמיה באתרים מקראיים כמו תבור וציון וחורב, אם תרצו, סקרי מונטי הוסיטים. ומתוך שכך, וכאן אני אסיים, נראה לי שאפשר לבחון את הקתוליזציה של המרחב גם כמופע נוסף של בוהמיה סקרה, שקדושתה אינהרנטית בנוף, מופע שמשנה את הקשרו התיאולוגי, אבל לא את זהותו הצ'כית. תודה.
Okay, I'm probably going to make another mistake in Czech. Jaroslav Svatek, is it okay? Einigermaßen. Holds a PhD in history at the University of Lille in France and at the Charles University in Prague, where he actually works as an assistant professor at the Faculty of Arts. Since 2006, he has also been working at the Center for Medieval Studies in Prague. His research interests include history of traveling, nobility, and the relations between the Kingdom of Bohemia and the Western Europe in the later Middle Ages. Today, he will speak about Jerusalem, tota quadro strata marmore subtili, holy city described in Czech medieval pilgrimage travelogues.
Thank you very much for introducing me. Thanks to Orit Amnon that they told me about this conference. Thanks to the organizers that have chosen me. Thanks to Nico Tabach, who is very perfect in organization. And thanks to Yitzhak Ben-Zvi for his wonderful place that I could speak and visit for the second time the city of Jerusalem. So I have about 10 minutes, if I understood. My paper will be I will try to fit in. So thanks to all these favorable circumstances, I was able to visit this holy city again. And as my current research deals with the medieval pilgrim travelogues to the Holy Land from Central Europe, I have chosen. Sorry. You have 15. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I have chosen a specific feature that I come across all the time when reading these texts. Two of them made by Bohemian travelers in the end of 15th century, which I will present here briefly in a moment, emphasize the material side of the city in their descriptions. So that's why you can read in the title a Latin quotation, Jerusalem tota quadro strata marmore subtili, which means the whole city of Jerusalem was paved by marble, with marble, square marble, but the whole sentence continues by set annihilatur totum. Everything now is dilapidated. We will therefore focus on this aspect not only on the symbolic level as the opening quotation suggests, but also on the practical one. The question then is, what role could the detailed rendering of the material aspect of the city, especially the stones, have played in transmitting the memory of the Holy City in Central Europe? I will very shortly present these two texts. So the first one is the travel account of Utrecht priest Martin Krzywousty, who probably visited Holy Land in 1474, 1475. And Utrecht priest, what does it mean? That it means some sort of non-Catholic priest of 15th century Bohemia. Thanks to Orit, you had a small introduction into the religious situation in Bohemia in the end of Middle Ages. So I don't go into detail. in that way. So this priest visited Holy Land, and his testimony is quite rarely preserved in two different versions, in Latin and in Czech, in two manuscripts. The Czech manuscript is the later copy from 16th century and is very damaged, but it was published twice, as you can see, and the Latin was published just now by myself. If you are interested in, I have still two old-fashioned paper separata of my paper, or you can just write me an email. I will send you the article with this edition. The other text is that's also the Itinera, which is not so traditional to Holy Land, because Martin Krivousti visited during his way the southern Italy. And here you can see also the first folio of the Latin version, which I will quote all the time. The second text is preserved only in one manuscript from the beginning of 16th century. It was written by Czech nobleman Jan Hasištejnský of Lobkovice. And his problem is that it's only in Czech, and also the edition is very oldish. We are waiting for a new one, and I don't think that it was translated into English or some other world language, even if it is a very detailed account about the way from 1493. So the pilgrimage from which we have another travel accounts. So that's what is important to note is that Jan Hasištejnský, on the contrary, was a Catholic nobleman, and he is not so tolerant, not only vis-à-vis the Muslims, of course, but also vis-à-vis the other Eastern Christians, which he just labeled them as sects who pretend to be Christians. Yeah, but I will not go into this problematic now, because I will try to find, or I will show the aspect which unifies these two different travelogues, and that's just the material aspect of Jerusalem, which is discussed. Only to your overview, there are some other testimonies from Czech lands about the Holy Land, so it's only to put them in context, but I will only focus on two of them. So, the general aspect of Jerusalem is indicative of its present deplorable condition, as we saw in the opening passage. However, like many other travelers, Martin Krivousti, the Utraquist man, reflects more on biblical events that tell of the city's previous catastrophe, such as the destruction of the temple and the entire city by Nebuchadnezzar. So that's the quotation in Latin, where from the last phrase you can see a certain moral appeal of the Utraquist priest, which is evident, reminding us the vainglory of any material construction, however sacred. This idea is repeated once again in that quote, where he speaks about the translation of the stones of the temple and of the city to Babylon during this conquest. And in both cases, of course, Martin follows the idea that Babylon is actually in Cairo in Egypt, of course. Yeah. So, but despite the previous destructions of the city and its past glory, both of our travelers concentrate on detailed descriptions of the actual standing of buildings and or shrines, even though most of them were created after biblical times. Jan Hasištejnský does not use the similar words to describe the destruction of the city, but rather to describe the beauty of the built monuments in a very positive way, as we can see in the example of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The temple is built and made entirely of chiseled stone, As one enters it, there is a tall square tower on the right hand, also nicely built of chiseled stone, and on top of it is a truss all glazed with chiseled stone, and the whole temple is also vaulted. There are smooth marble pillars in it, tall, thick, and smooth, and on which the vault of the temple rests. So you can see in the constantly repeated formulation chiseled stone how he is interested in the material aspect of the temple construction. In the same temple, his colleague, let's say, Martin, admires the artistic rendering of the crucifixion site, which is made from small stones, which are also polished, and which from then a figure is composed. Yeah, the problem of this observation is that of course, we can recognize that Martin is interested in the technique of mosaic, but he's not able to describe it by proper words in Latin nor in Czech. Yeah? And perhaps his audience shouldn't be able to understand it. On the other hand, he brings it into the line with the well-known decoration for his readers, that is so-called Golden Gate in the south facade of the St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague, as you can see on the photo. In addition to expressing the nature of the material and the way it was processed, it was important for both Czech travelogues to approach the specific dimensions of sacred space and to express them using units. The author's own judgments was used in both texts. This is particularly evident in Jan Hasištinský's description of the holy places on Mount Zion, especially the cenacle area or the cenacle shrine. As you can see here, he really measures the dimensions of the piece, 14 or 15 steps. On the right hand, on the main altar, is another one, distant 3 steps, etc., etc. We can continue as well. It seems to me, according to my reason, that everything happened in one room because all the holy places are here together in space measuring 12 steps. Yeah, so that's something which he emphasizes. His interest may have been motivated by the construction of, and I go on in the topic just summoned by Orit, the second Jerusalem, somewhere in Bohemia, and that's the case of a monastery in Kadaň and the whole area of small town of Kadaň, which was just under patronate of this nobleman of Jan, and it's also one of the nice first examples of physical translatio terrae sanctae in Bohemia, prior to Římov, prior to other places. And the expansion of the monastery of 14 holy helpers, which is also visible here on the fresco, just you can see the fresco of in the church, in the main church of the monastery, where is the crucifixion, but also on the background you can see also the Veduta of Jerusalem, but also this replica or this painting of a monastery. So you can see the painting of the monastery in the monastery. Yeah. So that he was Jan Hasištinský was just a patron of the monastery, and after his return in 1493, he restored the monastery in the new dimensions according to the measurements of his experience. Yeah. So that's the reason of careful indication of the dimensions in his travelogue, and of course in his, for example, that's a very nice example which is where the experts on architecture just identified one of the pieces on the first floor. It's important to say, in first floor in the monastery and convent, like to be a replica of the piece of cenaculum in Mount Zion, of course vaulted a little bit differently, but by a new-fashioned cellar vaulting, and from the end of beginning of 16th century, end of 15th, and a similar way of thinking, of course, can be found in Nuremberg. where the traveler hands to her in his printed travelogue mentioned yesterday by Professor Bianca Kuhnel, is more eloquent in this respect, because he compares the proportions of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with the Church of St. Sebald, whose reconstruction he directed after his return from the Holy Land. So it's the similar case, approximately in the same time. But what could have been the motivation of the priest, Martin Křivoustý, who apparently did not build anything? Martin describes the center point of the pilgrimage. Oh, sorry, that's another picture of St. Sebald. Martin described the center point of the pilgrimage, the Christ empty tomb, in detail, as you can see, by saying the stone on which Christ was laid is the place of the altar, and the priests celebrate Mass on that stone. I myself have said Mass there 3 times. Now the stone is lined with smooth stone, so that pilgrims don't peel anything off, because everyone wants a piece of the tomb of God. End of quotation. Martin, therefore, among other things, gives testimony of his own activity on the pilgrimage. If we are believed to his words, it is possible that he celebrated Mass 3 times in the sacred place during his nightly visit of the church, as he did once directly at the place of execution, as he said, it is on the hill of Calvary. He himself participates on the operation and presence of the sacred in such significant places in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Never mind that he was a Eutychist and not a Catholic priest. It didn't matter in Terra Sancta for him. His contemporary, Jan Hasištejnský, could only be a passive recipient of the information. He was not active, of course, in that way, about the sacred places. With their tangible clues, the stones were for him the remnants of the biblical dramas that this pilgrim seeks to convey in the same vein as we have seen above. That is illustrated again by his description of the church somewhere in Mount Zion, perhaps St. Peter in Gallicantu, where he says, a little further on the right, we went to a small church, etc. And he describes the huge stone, of 3 Marys, or according to the Gospel of Mark, where 3 Marys were asking who will roll the stone away from the door of the tomb. For it was huge, Hasištejn says, as it is written in the scriptures. And the stone is longer than my fathom, and is about 2 cubits broad, and almost 2 cubits thick in the middle. Yeah, so another measurement. Yeah. We can take from his travelogue some other similar information, like where he uses units of length, or his own actual measurements. Yeah? At the other times, the reader learns, for example, that the stone in Bethany, on which Christ rested when he came there with his disciples, is round like a loaf of bread. Yeah? Unlike Křivoustý, Hasištejn's diary is a testimony that reproduces known imprints of New Testament events in a manner much more conformable to tradition and other pilgrimage accounts. Yeah? One of the most famous examples is the site mentioned also by Professor Michele Bacci, the site of extension of Mount of Olives, which of course is mentioned in many other travelogues. And also, Hasištejn just brings his own experience, or perhaps takes this experience from other sources, by saying that in the middle of the chapel is the place where the Lord Christ ascended to the heaven, etc. And there is stone made from a white marble, perhaps 1 cubit long and wide, and a footprint on the right foot is there carved out. Yeah. So, according to the Czech noble, we find traces of biblical drama elsewhere in his travelogue. The pillar of Christ's scourging in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the relatively rare, but also elsewhere appearing hiding place of John the Baptist in Zachariah's house near Bethlehem, where Hasištejn says, the child's hand is still visible in the rock, as if it had been pressed into the wax. Here we can build on the study of the French historian Jean-Marie Fritz, who dealt comprehensively with these traces. Yeah. Halstein not only documents these traces in the stones, but in the spirit of Franciscan piety, he himself attempts to insert part of his body into them. He proceeds like Jacopo de Verona 150 years before on Mount Sinai, who also wanted to introduce himself into the caverna, just like Moses did according to the Old Testament. Perhaps the most powerful moment in this sense for Jan was when he was able to rest himself on the stone in the church, in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus was said to have declared to be the center of the world. And Halstein says, I lay and slept on that rock for about 2 hours. So, the umbilicus mundi, mentioned many times at this conference, became a suitable place to sleep for a medieval Czech nobleman. I conclude. In addition to the need to describe in detail the biblical sites in Jerusalem and to bring the Holy Land in word, image, and deed into their own environment, the pilgrims sought to bring the biblical message by the careful description, measurement, and inspection of the buildings and stones in Jerusalem. By this transmission, they confirmed the authenticity of Scripture. Based on the contemporary trend of Franciscan piety, the desire to identify with Christ may have played a role for Jan Halstein. His travelogue attests the long life of the scholastic tradition, which, on the basis of Augustine's work, De Trinitate, pits remnant against image or traced against representation. In this case, the imprints of biblical figures on the stones are not representations but signs of agency, a dynamic and dramatic dimension. While the image fixes, the remnant dramatizes, which is appealing to the Franciscans and their way of making Christ present and imitating him. While this aspect can be documented in several places in Jan's Halsteinski diary, the Utraquist Martin is somewhat more reticent in this respect. The beauty and showiness of Jerusalem is, for his moralistic disposition, a foreshadowing of the destruction of that city, which he initially recalls. Nor does he gloss over the city's wretched condition during his visit, but on the other hand, by constantly reminding us of the quality of the workmanship of certain buildings, he too contributes to the shifting of the Holy City's reputation. Toda rabba.